I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Keona Ervin.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, okay, let's make sure that's working. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the Institute for organizing this trip. It's a pleasure to be here. I've had such a wonderful visit. I'll be sad to go tomorrow. Thank you so much for welcoming me. I was very pleased to learn of this series focused on, yeah.
I have to get this closer.
Sure.
Got to
Okay.
be a rock star.
All right, I'll try. I was very pleased to learn of this speaker series on the state of the American worker. I think it's a very timely topic as I think our nation is kind of thinking harder about issues of income inequality. And so I come to this subject matter through a couple of prisms. Firstly, I'm interested in the history of social movements in the United States, particularly those waged by Black Americans. But also, even beyond that, I'm interested in the history of Black workers and Black women workers in particular. So there's a lot of things happening today that I think call us to kind of think about these issues. And so I'm coming at this from the perspective of Black working class women, their contributions to this notion of the labor movement. So we are currently witnessing the beginnings of one of the most important social justice struggles since the 1960s. I think these are familiar faces. They've been in the media quite a bit, right? I'm speaking of course, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi. That struggle, the struggle that they represent, the Black Lives Matter movement, as it's commonly called, has become in popular media synonymous with prison reform, the fight perhaps against mass incarceration, surveillance, what they call state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown people. But a deeper look, however, reveals that the movement for Black lives is much broader. In the same year that Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza founded this network, #Black Lives Matter, fast food workers went on strike in New York City, initiating a movement against income inequality. Fight for 15, a campaign predominated by low-wage workers of color, now spans more than 200 cities, 35 countries, and 6 continents. Labor activists created the #Black Workers Matter to assert that the decades-long jobs crisis in Black America, in America more generally, certainly, but in Black America in particular, was as much an urgent issue as any other. Black Workers Matter, this #movement, the Fight for 15, aimed to signify solidarity with racial justice struggles, to stake claim to a kind of unionism that was social justice oriented, to connect itself to Black struggles for justice in the past, and to draw attention to the economic precarity of Black labor in our current moment. Now, even campaigns that make explicit calls for better policing, as they put it, or as a fair, and calls for a fair criminal justice system, share direct links with what we have come to understand as the labor movement. Alicia Garza serves as the Special Projects Director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance, building their movement around securing labor protections for domestic workers, state by state. Alliance organizers mobilized to bring about adoption of a domestic worker Bill of Rights in states such as New York, in Massachusetts, in California. And in this struggle, immigration, especially, immigrant labor and the global labor market figure rather prominently. They have emerged as central concerns, as a groundswell of grassroots campaigners have revitalized a worker rights movement in the United States over the past decade. Now, speaking on the Alliance's approach, Garza comments, she says, what's valuable about the National Domestic Workers Alliance is that we organize women at the intersections through a 3-dimensional organizing model. Meaning, we don't just organize workers as workers. We organize women, women of color, and immigrant women who are poor, low income, and working class. Though Garza leads movements that are organized under separate covers, she nevertheless sees the work that she does as deeply interwoven because, in her words, the mothers of children who are being stolen by law enforcement are themselves wage workers, breadwinners, or the sole support for their children. These working mothers, some of whom have become the face of Black families victimized by police violence, are also members of the labor movement. Now, these connections kind of go hidden in terms of the conversation about the Black Lives Matter movement. So Sabrina Fulton, she's the mother of Trayvon Martin. She's a member of the Office and Professional Employees International Union. Leslie McSpadden, Michael Brown's mother, is a member of the United Food and Commercial Workers International Union, Local 88. So with an emphasis on this kind of multi-sector, multi-issue approach, Black Lives Matter activists, in kind of hidden ways, are actually extending, as much as they are remaking, key social movements of the past. So when Alicia Garza observes it, quote, Black Lives Matter is not just about police brutality. What we are fighting around are the contours of Black life. She is capturing an organizing principle that has guided some of the most generative forms of Black freedom struggle in the past century, many of which were fashioned by Black working class women. Now, that principle, a feature of political struggle for much of the so-termed American century, has been a creative pairing of movements for what activists understand as racial justice with economic justice. It's a pairing that Black women organizers helped to construct in really unique ways. More than this, women's efforts to establish economic dignity were indispensable. For example, without Black working class women, the campaign to organize Pullman porters to the 1920s and 1930s would not have resulted in Black working class men accessing collective bargaining rights as members of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Without Black working class women, many of whom were nameless and are still nameless, Black cooperative campaigns in the 1930s in places like Harlem, where migrants from the US South and the Caribbean built a kind of Black cosmopolitanism, could not have successfully pooled resources and circulated them throughout communities. The March on Washington movement of the 1940s broke racial and economic barriers by pushing for, in particular, and especially in St. Louis, Black women's access to defense employment during World War II. And a decade later, a critical mass of domestic workers in Montgomery, Alabama, organized and helped to implement a 381-day bus boycott, over a year long, that resulted in the court striking down segregation on city buses. The Mississippi Freedom Labor Union, organized in 1965, represented Black maids, cotton workers, and tractor drivers in their efforts to strike for better conditions. The tenant rights and welfare rights movement of the 60s and 70s positioned low-income Black women as citizens who deserved respect and public concern for their survival. So I have touched on only a few examples. There are many. There are many of these examples that kind of illustrate the centrality of Black working class women's contributions. But we encounter a kind of puzzle or a quandary when we consider how to make sense of the history of Black women as workers, the history of their economic activism. Where exactly do they belong? They're often hidden or absent within histories of the civil rights movement. They're often footnotes within kind of traditional histories of the labor movement. Histories of the women's rights movement often ignore working class Black women, with some exceptions, but that's kind of the trend. And what is more, often Black working class women are often understood as passive subjects, as symbols of oppression, economic or racial, not necessarily as agents of history, in the words of Primala Madison. Or if they do appear on the historical stage, we often understand Black working class women as actors who are organizing primarily on behalf of others. But tonight, this evening, I would like to focus my remarks on alternative ways of depicting this history of Black women and the labor movement. I think what happens when we revolve this historical narrative around this particular group, I think our understanding kind of shifts. What happens when we frame these women as political analysts and as architects, I think along three particular lines, we're invited to reimagine the history of 20th century American labor activism and the US labor movement. So those three lines I'll explain right now. First, the question of who comprised the working class, I think, shifts. For most of the 20th century, the iconography of the working class featured white male industrial workers, usually in heavy industry. The emergence of the New Deal and a working class-based Black freedom movement entrenched this representation as constructs of the forgotten man and the disaffected Black male wage earner, organized the logic of what Stephen Fraser and his colleague called the New Deal order, as well as approaches to Black advancement through political action. But what about workers whose images were not reflected back to them in public? What about workers who were outside of the parameters of who constituted a worker as defined by the state? Black working class women were initially excluded, were largely excluded from the labor and economic protections sanctioned and codified by the New Deal. The Fair Labor Standards Act, the Social Security Act, for example, excluded domestic and agricultural work, fields in which African American women were overrepresented. Similarly, the National Recovery Act allowed race-based wage differentials. The Federal Housing Act did not lend mortgages to Blacks who desired to move into suburban neighborhoods. In the case of other measures that Blacks had more access to, like the Works Progress Administration, racial discrimination at the local and state level often prohibited the equal distribution of resources. In terms of state-based aid, means-tested policies crafted constructions of the deserving and undeserving, and at times excluded Black workers or stigmatized them for the paltry benefits that they, in fact, received. Now, this is not to say that the New Deal, or for that matter, its descendants, the Fair Deal, the Great Society, certainly, did not benefit Black workers, Black working class women. They most certainly did. It is also true, however, that the modern welfare state extended the concept of racial difference, embedding it within the very structure of American liberalism. Secondly, what is also challenged by, in a sense, understanding women like these as political architects? I think our understanding of what was the labor movement, what did it constitute, actually shifts too. So looking through the prism of Black working class women's activism, I think our understanding of the labor movement deepens, it expands. Narrow definitions of labor activism are inadequate. Mainstream union leaders sometimes excluded Black working class women, and even some progressive unions were hostile or initially unwelcoming to their presence. Now, we should not use union membership rates among Black women as the sole or, in some cases, primary indicator of their participation in the labor movement. It's one index, but not the only one. Black working class women often used multiple methods to form a kind of collective relationship with their employers. These methods certainly included unionization, but they were not limited to it. And what is more, Black working class women tended to define the labor movement in the broadest possible terms. For them, the labor movement was unmistakably a social justice movement. So mobilizing for workers' rights necessarily involved the larger work of making dignity a kind of structural imperative, an imperative evident in institutions, in policies, and in practices. And this work included not simply collective action to win higher wages and better working conditions, though it certainly involved those too, but it also involved challenging unions when they engaged in racial and gender discrimination. So framing the labor movement as a social justice struggle meant that organizing for workers took as its vantage point the community and workers' living concerns in a kind of total sense. So we find Black working class women in the 20th century focusing their political work around housing, around welfare and transportation and childcare, healthcare, in addition to the fight for better jobs, higher wages, a living wage, and respect on the job. I think these issues encompass what we might understand as the labor movement. Finally, positioning these women as our kind of lens, I think challenges how we understand how the labor movement did its work. What's the method, right, in the 20th century? So Black working class women created unique approaches. Their stylings were unique in terms of organizing their labor. They mobilized, for instance, around the emotional and affective labor that characterized their work. They drew upon public spaces like public housing, like city buses, to mobilize communities. They constructed community organizations to build support for their movement. They used storytelling to mold a shared agenda and amass collective narratives of abuse, exploitation, and resistance. They formed associations to act as unions, to mimic the work of unions as collective bargaining mechanisms. And they often worked to equip individual employees to bargain with employers on their own, instead of commissioning a bureaucracy to do so on their behalf. Some Black working class women were in favor of unions, others were not. Some pursued, quote, the confrontational zero-sum model guiding traditional labor organizing, while others embraced negotiation and the enlistment of employers as crucial allies. Now, I don't mean to suggest that these tactics were unique to Black women, only that it was kind of a key feature of how Black women approached labor organizing. Now, there are numerous examples that can illustrate how Black women enlarge and deepen the parameters of what we understand as the U.S. labor movement, forcing us, I think, or inviting us to rethink how workers have historically mobilized for rights and justice. But I'll focus my talk around three examples, around the case of domestic workers in St. Louis, around the activism of one activist named Oralee Malone, also out of St. Louis. And I'll spend the bulk of my time talking about the third example, which is the story of public housing tenants in St. Louis, who all of them placed a kind of premium on what they called a decent living, mobilizing around that concept. So they infused, all three examples, you'll see that they infused welfare recipient, public housing tenant, inner city resident, and worker with a kind of political capital, turning such nomenclature of public derision and contempt into platforms from which to claim a kind of full-fledged citizenship. Now, before we get to those three examples, I'd like to talk a bit about St. Louis, because now I'm shifting the conversation to the city that I study. But I think these examples abound across the United States. So, a word about what makes St. Louis a kind of ideal spot for thinking about Black women's labor activism. Firstly, here's an image of the waterfront, the St. Louis waterfront in the 1920s. So the Gateway City, as it was commonly called, is a promising site, firstly because Black women's economic politics played a crucial defining role in what the historian Clarence Lang calls, and he's borrowing from the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci, a historic bloc, meaning that workers' agenda formed the kind of core of the Black freedom struggle in St. Louis from the 1930s to the 1970s. He's talking about this mass nature of Black popular struggles during this period that favored workers, that favored the laboring majority. Lang finds that, quote, Black workers decisively led, forming the nucleus of Black cross-class coalitions of resistance as they acted as representatives of the popular will. Black working class women made persuasive public appeals to the right to human dignity as constitutive members of this bloc. Their struggles as domestics, as pecan shellers, as the unemployed, as beauty operators, as clerks, as defense plant workers, I could go on, garment factory employees, welfare recipients, public housing tenants. All of these help them to kind of indelibly mark the formation of a modern Black urban political agenda, one that prioritized workers' living concerns. So why St. Louis number two? So there's the formation of that bloc, the nature of the Black freedom struggle prioritizing worker concerns. Number two, St. Louis's industrial landscape was feminized in two senses. The first sense is that the city lacked a kind of large-scale single industry that dominated its local economy. So meat packing and auto manufacturing plants and steel foundries or manly production facilities were not in abundance as in, say, Chicago or Pittsburgh or Detroit. Rather, St. Louis's economy was rather diverse and retail-driven. This is in a kind of distinction to East St. Louis. Here's an image from 1917, right, the East St. Louis race riot. The city of East St. Louis, by contrast, located, of course, just across the Mississippi, had large-scale, at this time, basic manufacturing plants because of its rich coal fields and cheaper railroad rates, rivaling centers in the East and Upper Midwest. East St. Louis had steel foundries, smelters, refineries, chemical plants, flour and feed mills, stockyards, meat packing plants, and railroad plants that all dotted its landscape to such a degree that, quote, those on the east side, talking about East St. Louis, have been adjusted to large-scale eastern business, and the west side plants, back in St. Louis City, to smaller local consumption. So the St. Louis side of things is kind of understood as the consuming side, right? The heavy manufacturing characterizing the East St. Louis economy, of course, was a key factor in fomenting racial hostilities among white working class members who felt threatened by the labor competition of black workers who were part of that important Great Migration of the early to mid-20th century. St. Louis had no major race riot. It had its racial moments, I should say, but no major race riot that approximated the devastation of the East St. Louis race riot of 1917. So thirdly, why is St. Louis crucial? It's feminized, we might say, in another sense. So St. Louis's economy, its industrial landscape accentuated women's employment, broadly speaking. So this I'm talking about, in this case, the whole of women workers in the city. City boosters promoted St. Louis as an ideal location for capital expenditure because, among other factors, women laborers were abundant and affordable. This is kind of the language of the time. The St. Louis Chamber of Commerce boasted, for instance, that women industrial workers were, quote, excellent and performed at a lower cost. A study published by the Chamber of Commerce's Industrial Bureau noted that women, quote, frequently perform operations which in other cities are done almost wholly by males, such as the packing and weighing of moderately heavy materials and many other jobs requiring accuracy and care. Large industry leaders reported that they typically employed women 90% during normal times, whereas in other unnamed cities, employers used not more than 75% of its female workforce. Now, the Chamber of Commerce made no explicit reference to race in its discussion of women's work and the availability and desirability of women's work, but race, of course, as we know, mattered deeply. Black working class women, as in other cities across the U.S., worked in some of the most menial positions in the city, mainly as domestic workers. One student of the period put it like this, quote, the Negro woman wage earner is probably the most consistent and persistent worker in the St. Louis labor market. Drawing a distinctive line away from the trend in white women's employment, he went on, saying, neither maidenhood, wifehood, nor the widow's weeds tend to eliminate for her, the black woman worker, the necessity of work. And when considering black women and their economic lives in St. Louis, contemporaries of the 1940s noted that St. Louis was, quote, the worst city and the seat of undemocratic and reactionary labor policies. So black women's experience or economic experience in St. Louis becomes a kind of index for judging the labor landscape of the city as a whole. For one organizer, St. Louis, the quote is this, there was, quote, no other city in the nation than St. Louis where employment conditions are as bad for colored girls and women, using the kind of naming of that period. Finally, why St. Louis? Now, compounding the reality of black women's confinement to some of the lowest rungs of the paid labor market was the fact of their demographic command. Black women in St. Louis, as in other cities, engineered black migration to St. Louis, to borrow a phrase from historian Leslie Brown. In the very early 20th century, black women in the gateway city in St. Louis matched and would later outpace the rate of black male migration, especially in the working age category. This trend would stretch into the 1940s and in subsequent decades. So black working class women in St. Louis and certainly in other cities would form the majority of the black population, and they were transformed into often hyper-visible subjects of surplus worker discourses, often as indicators of black familial deviancy and racial backwardness. So they become part of these discourses about, in a sense, women working too much, or black workers, or there are too many black working people in the St. Louis labor economy. They become wrapped up in that kind of conversation. Now, in the gateway city as elsewhere, place was political. And in St. Louis, black working class women manipulated the city's crossroads character to achieve political ends. St. Louis, a border city, had knotty racial politics that blended historically Southern and historically Northern influences. One writer described the city's method of infusing its economy and spatial landscape with racial meaning as, quote, something like checkmate between the influences of the North and the South. Holding together and in tension competing status markers that included the gateway to the West, traditionally Southern, and the gate city to the Promised Land, St. Louis had an uneven, segregated landscape. Policies and customs barred black residents from theaters, parks, schools, and restaurants, or required them to sit in designated areas, while black riders in the city's streetcars sat where they pleased. Like their counterparts in northern cities, black St. Louisans did not face the comprehensive disenfranchisement projects that barred black Southerners from the vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and of course, violence. Blacks in St. Louis held political office. They built small-scale Republican and later Democratic Party machines, and through the vote influenced election outcomes at the local and statewide level. As a major border South city, St. Louis was a key battleground for struggles over race and housing. Two important Supreme Court decisions, Shelley versus Kramer, 1948, a battle over racial restrictive covenants, and Jones versus Mayer in 1968, in which the courts affirmed Congress's right to determine cases of housing discrimination and to regulate the sale of private property. Both of these cases originated in St. Louis. In 1959, Davis versus the St. Louis Housing Authority, a local court case argued by attorneys Frankie Freeman and Constance Baker Motley, legally ended racial discrimination in public housing. A 1974 case, United States versus the City of Blackjack, filed in the 8th District Circuit Court of St. Louis County, ordered the city of Blackjack, a second-ring suburb, to allow construction of multifamily residential units designed for low-income families because, according to the ruling, failing to do so denied working-class citizens, in this case black residents especially, their right to equal protection and due process. So across the 20th century, battles over residential segregation, battles over jobs and the economy were largely representative and anticipatory of national trends. Okay, so that's the backdrop, right? That's kind of the picture of St. Louis. Let me get to the three examples, okay? The first one is that of domestic workers, right? Now I'm dealing with mainly nameless individuals, nameless historical actors who don't leave papers, at the archives, right? We wish, but that's just not the case. So the images I'll show are largely from my collection. They're archival materials, newspapers often. I wish I could show more pictures of these women, but I'll try to describe their work as vividly as I can. Largely denied membership in organized labor and access to basic labor protections, domestic workers, African-American domestic workers of St. Louis, used the local chapter of the St. Louis Urban League, particularly the Urban League's women's division, to carve out a space for themselves in a growing, predominantly white male labor movement, and in the multiple coalitions that formed or gave shape to the New Deal. Organizing with leaders of the women's division, or progressive black club women who advocated on behalf of black working class women, domestic workers used household employment codes, reform codes, to lay the groundwork for dignity to manifest itself in their labor and contractual agreements. Domestic workers in St. Louis engaged in their own mass action struggle when about 500 of them gathered at the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA for a mass meeting in September 1933. They organized to remake the so-termed private sphere of household labor relations through standardization. They won key labor reforms in doing so. Their wages increased. Those who were employing domestic workers had to agree to a certain wage scale. Their conditions improved. They fought for the right to no longer wash windows from the outside, for instance, right? And working women themselves had greater political leverage overall because of the advocacy of an organization like the Urban League. They had greater support, greater moral legitimacy when they continued to engage in that resistance after this mass meeting. So such shift in domestic employment really happened all over the country, but they came not by way of protest politics, right, which was very popular during this period. And they did not come through unionization, right, but rather through the kind of gritty work of negotiation and alliances built between domestic workers and their employers. As historian Primala Nadesan shows in her new book, which I recommend that you all read, called Household Workers Unite, it's a history of domestic workers organizing in the United States, domestic workers were hardly the least likely to organize. Right? Just because they worked in private households did not mean that they cannot engage in collective action. They employed strategies and waged campaigns that challenged long-held assumptions about their work, their capacity for labor organizing, and the means by which workers, as a collective, might effectively engage in political struggle. A second example is that of Orally Malone. She was born in 1918 in segregated Brooksville, Mississippi, the eldest of 9 children. She developed a community-oriented style of unionism. She was an activist, in her own words, who was mixed up in all of these causes. She fashioned a cutting-edge activist ethos that centered economic justice for poor and working-class women and men, especially for workers of color. She moved to St. Louis in 1951, bringing with her a style of working-class activism. Her favorite activist was A. Philip Randolph. She helped to unionize African-American workers in St. Louis under the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union in 1956. So within 5 years of moving to the city, she helps to organize a local. Because of her successful effort, Malone became a shop steward, advocating for single and married workers and those who felt the brunt of discriminatory practices. Her 19 years as shop steward mushroomed into an international business representative position for which she represented nearly 40 shops and stores in St. Louis and southern Missouri. A founding member, and this is a long list, I'm exhausted just reading it, a founding member of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, the A. Philip Randolph Institute, the Women's Political Caucus, and the St. Louis Coalition of Labor Union Women. Malone organized St. Louis's first multiracial women's labor conference in the early 1970s. Now, this gathering brought together approximately 400 working class women from various industries, across color, across ethnicity, to think about ways to promote unionization as a viable solution for poor and working class women. One of their kind of mottos was organize those who are unorganized, who are the unorganized among us. Now, Malone's calls for social change gave shape to the political upheavals of the mid-70s and 80s. Her work as chairwoman of the Coalition Against Apartheid and the trip that she took to Botswana during the 1980s demonstrated that she was working out a kind of St. Louis-based unionism that was transnational, right? Still a kind of local version that thought about, you know, the context of work in a kind of international sense. This is a quote from Malone. I actually conducted a series of oral histories with her in 2009, 2010, but she would rail against the NAACP and say, well, they just aren't focused enough on work, on the economy, on the condition of ordinary people. She says, I'm much more comfortable in the streets. I think this is my water, is that right? Excuse me. She says, I'm much more comfortable in the streets with the people, listening to what the people have to say, because they really have the message. I love to hear her rail against the NAACP. It's really funny. So community-oriented unionism, this was her style. She's merging in this period civil rights agendas, feminist agendas, certainly working class agendas, and prioritizing women's voices within them. Her colleagues described her work in this way. They said Malone was, quote, many leagues ahead of conventional practice and on the cutting edge of the struggle for economic justice for workers and the struggle for civil rights. Malone became known for this kind of style of expansive unionism, which centered social causes. Unions were crucial, she said, but their focus, and I'm using her words, unions' focus is often too narrow. They don't reach out enough. They concentrate too much on wages, hours, and working conditions, which is part of the job, still her words, but they should also be concerned about transportation and health care, which to most workers are really more important. Most workers are fired over transportation and childcare issues. So Malone is tending to eschew the kind of narrow focus of wage consciousness to include a more expansive perspective that's thinking about workers' living concerns, right? She also focused on building women as leaders, women's political leadership. She said, women need to learn to fight the unions and make their demands heard, right? So she's turning that social justice emphasis to unions too, as much as she is to the larger community. She says, I guarantee the management, speaking of unions, I guarantee the management won't like you, but they will respect you. They will respect you. Finally, the rent strike of 1969. So 1950, St. Louis, I'll just set the context a little bit. It was a city in free fall, essentially. The fourth largest city in the US in 1900, it had fallen to 8th by 1950 and would drop to 26th by 1980. In 1950, a series called Progress or Decay, St. Louis Must Choose. In this series, Richard G. Baumhoff of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch expressed the fear that, quote, St. Louis would take a back seat among American cities. Trenchant problems in race relations, in housing and transportation, certainly in education, marked this period. Substandard housing, especially in St. Louis's inner city, especially, where blacks were contained and isolated by restrictive covenants, redlining, and zoning laws, were the examples to which Baumhoff pointed. Urban renewal programs, this is kind of the history of the urban crisis, right? Urban renewal programs designed to revitalize the city removed low-income blacks from zones that were targeted for commercial development. One plan, for example, displaced by the end of the 1950s approximately 20,000 residents, 90% black, from centrally located Mill Creek Valley, located just west of Union Station, when city officials deemed the community blighted. Here's an aerial shot of Mill Creek before it was demolished. Demolition on that 465-acre area began as Mayor Raymond Tucker looked on as workers of the R.E. Harder Contracting Company, which received a $125,000 contract from the city to demolish buildings in 90 days, took a headache ball to the tenement at 3818 Laclede Avenue. Working class blacks lost their homes, businesses, and community institutions. And this area was once a kind of hub for working class black life, especially black culture, black working class culture. And that was destroyed by forced dispersal. Here is Tucker in the trench coat looking on at the demolition, all right? In the immediate post-war period, the push to clean up the city through some clearance moved to the top of municipal priorities, when in 1949, the federal government dispersed funds to cities for redevelopment purposes, happening all across the country. Tucker and later Mayor Joseph Darst initiated sweeping initiatives, one of the largest municipal development plans in the city's history. One would be hard-pressed to find a resident in the 1950s who disagreed, though, with the idea that major public intervention was necessary in local housing. One study found that nearly 90% of black residents living in the city's tenements of the central area had no private flush toilets or baths, and just over 50% had no running water, and nearly 90% of the residents qualified for public housing. Overcrowding and dilapidation produced hazardous conditions for low-income black residents. Across the city, not only in Mill Creek, homes were often death traps. In early 1950, for example, an explosion killed 4, including 2 children, and injured 7 of 32 persons who were crammed into a building designed to house only 4 families. The ancient structure read a St. Louis American caption, quote, stands as grim testimony to the evils of Jim Crow housing and the vicious pattern of the ghetto system in St. Louis. Now, mayoral administrations promised low-income, predominantly black residents that they need not worry about relocation, that the city would allocate resources for construction of modern public housing. But when Carr Square, the first public housing project constructed for black residents in 1942, opened, more than 4,000 black families hoping to escape the ramshackle tenements with no electricity were put on a waiting list. I want to show you just 2 It's up close. So this is an up close shot of a Mill Creek Valley tenement, essentially. This is not a family. They're all renters in one apartment, essentially. Not related, but all sharing this particular dwelling, right? You can kind of get a feel for the structures that they are inhabiting, why they were often dangerous. The mother and son often became this image often became the face of urban poverty in this period. It's a very interesting kind of history. So mayoral administrations promised to get rid of this kind of housing in favor of public housing, right? Carr Square was the first major public housing development built in the 1940s, but over the course of the 50s, other major developments were constructed. Most infamously, we might say, Pruitt-Igoe, right? Wonderful documentary on that development. Consisting initially of 33 high-rise buildings that housed 11,500 residents, St. Louis's largest housing project was made possible by the Federal Housing Act of 1949, which provided funds to cities for urban development and slum clearance. Now, public housing construction did less to ameliorate the urban crisis than to reveal the factors that contributed to it. This was no truer the case than with the 1969 St. Louis rent strike, one of the first and largest in the post-war period. And this kind of history, I think, we need to say more about it. One of the largest rent strikes in the nation, one of the earliest happened in St. Louis. In the early part of the year, over 1,000 public housing tenants, about a quarter of the city's project dwellers, struck the St. Louis Housing Authority after it raised rents sixfold. Women from a number of developments, including Darst Webby and Clinton Peabody on the south side of town, all in a sense joined together, they were from the Pruitt-Igoe as well, to take radical action. Their action actually led to a successful outcome. They gained tenant control, they put freezes on rents, they were allowed to manage their properties. It was actually a kind of surprising outcome for many in the city. And it resulted really in the notion that tenants were citizens too. And those who were involved in this strike were also workers themselves, and they understood the fight for decent housing as deeply connected to the fight for living wage jobs. In fact, many of them, those who were involved in the rent strike, were also deeply involved in a working class labor movement in the 1960s as well, arguing against the Human Development Corporation that handled the welfare system in St. Louis, saying you need to do better about providing public assistance, providing job assistance to Black residents and the like. Right? So they saw these as deeply connected. Lastly, I just want to mention this study. I think it's well done. It's on the kind of thinking about Black women as labor leaders, and they understand kind of labor movement in what we might understand as traditional terms, in terms of unions, leadership. But it's a remarkable study that kind of focuses on how African American women have historically contributed to what we understand as the labor movement. So I'd like to conclude by pulling a quote from this particular study put on by the Institute for Policy Studies. It's from Rosalind Pellis. She's a retired director, right, of, as you see, the Civil, Human, and Women's Rights Department of the AFL-CIO. She has this beautiful quote, I think, at the end of that study, where she talks exactly about what I'm trying to kind of suggest here with how the history of Black working class women rethinks or revises our understanding of the history of the labor movement. She says, we need leaders who can take a stand on issues in the workplace and issues in the community. I hope labor moves out of a small notion of what the labor movement is toward a notion that the labor movement is part of a social justice movement. If something happens in the plant, or when something happens in Ferguson, Missouri, right? Workers should be there in full colors and in full motion. That's what unionism is. We've got to get a hold of that as part of our tradition. Now, of course, Black working class women were not the only historical actors to make these kinds of links, right? They were not the only ones to challenge narrow representations. But the point is to think about the fact that the kind of unionism that Rosalind Pellis is pointing to is just the sort of worker rights tradition that Black working class women of the 20th century singularly contributed to, singularly authored. I think it's really telling that we have an image of Rosalind Pellis here with William Barber in the background, right? He's the architect of the Moral Monday movement out of North Carolina, which was organizing to oppose state cuts to Medicaid, unemployment benefits, and public education funding, right? She is actually an organizer with that movement too. I think this image really captured the sense of understanding the labor movement in the broadest possible terms. So with that, I'll end and take questions. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Doctor, and we'll open the floor right away to your questions or comments, and I'll just let you field questions.
Sure, right? Sure, absolutely. Yeah, right in front. Thank you.
I have.
Let me get a microphone. Who needs to run?
If you were facing some sort of discrimination or injustice on a job, you know, in this day and age,
yeah.
What really can you do? Because
yeah.
I've been discriminated against.
Yeah.
I've had racist comments made to me. I've been treated very badly.
Yeah.
I've been fired for being pregnant.
Yeah.
I've had bosses committing tax fraud, giving me W-2 forms with the wrong years on them, paying people under the table,
yeah.
working in places where, like, you know, the temperature's too high in kitchens for the food to be sanitary.
Wow.
I've had to call the health department on my own job.
Wow. Wow.
Then they lie and make you stay in there, won't let you have a fan, don't turn on the air. I've seen it all.
Yeah, yeah.
And I've called like everybody, but nothing ever happens. And apparently there's a watchdog, but it doesn't do anything.
Yeah, yeah. So what to do, right? I think, I mean, there's a sense, I think, among workers in the 20th century, right, that, at least the ones I studied, that there's power in collectivity, right? So approaching problems that you described, which sound a lot like the problems that women in this past century have encountered, there was power for them in joining together along some lines, right? And it could begin just with, what are your problems, right? Come over to my home, I'll feed you, or we'll have some, we'll drink, whatever, we'll have some food, but we'll talk about what we are encountering on this job, right? And often, a lot of these struggles started there with conversations. But, I think they would all say, in some respects, that, to try to engage these issues as an individual would not be the productive way to go, right? To find out what other workers are encountering, and to think too about what you're encountering as part of a larger kind of social justice question, right? That involves, of course, these conditions that are happening on the job that are unique to your particular job, but that are connected to perhaps workers who are experiencing maybe similar kinds of things in other industries. So I think at least the organizing models that I've studied often begin with meetings, conversations, workers getting together and talking. Think about what comes to mind is consciousness raising groups of the 1970s and the women's struggle, for instance, right? Women sitting around and talking about their problems, and then discovering through that conversation that there's a kind of thread connecting their experiences, right? That this is pointing to a kind of larger policy, a larger structure that could then be challenged. I think that's what a lot of these women are. That's, in a sense, the kind of blueprint that they followed. Yeah. Thank you.
Steve has a question.
Okay, please.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And some insights on the situation with Black working women.
Yeah.
The question I have is, throughout your discussion, you talked about community interests and how important they were.
Right.
Could you address how significant, if at all, is the role of environmental justice?
Oh, yeah.
Within, as an organizing principle for community interests.
Yeah.
especially with black working class women
Yeah.
within the movements you've been talking about.
Yes, thank you. And you just raised an issue that I need to put into my book. Thank you for that. No, but lead poisoning was an important issue that was central, actually, to that rent strike. Actually, strikers who were involved in kind of challenging public housing and the lack of maintenance there were also talking about the home as a kind of death trap in the sense of environmental issues, right? And really kind of trying to put pressure on the state and certainly on city government to address that in a kind of systemic way. So the quest for what we might understand as environmental justice was deeply central to these women, especially those who were engaging the housing question kind of head on. And it also forms a kind of environmental justice, forms a kind of core core issue of workers' living concerns. As many black working class women were just really suspicious, and I think rightly so, of this kind of housing development story, generally speaking, the one that was kind of, preached to the media, we might say, or kind of held up as an example of St. Louis moving forward. They were deeply suspicious of that project, and that suspicion stemmed in part from this concern that these homes are not only structurally unsound, they are also perhaps leading to a kind of slow death, we might say, right, through sickness, through illness, and the like. And the connections to the contemporary scene abound, right? Flint, Michigan, as a profound example. But what's happening now is that we're seeing that this issue is not relegated to just Flint, right? That this is something that is much larger, and poor communities especially are bearing the brunt of this. So thank you so much for that question. Yeah.
Yeah, they were talking about Baltimore this week.
Right. Yes. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think there was a question behind.
How open are the older mainline industrial unions like UAW
Yeah.
and Teamsters to partnering with
Yeah.
social justice movements?
Would you say today, or in the past?
Well, in
Generally
general,
speaking, yeah. Well, certainly today, I think you have a lot of wonderful openings, I would say, to kind of think about, reflect back on the history of racial discrimination within organized labor, broadly speaking, and a real commitment on the part of unions like the UAW to kind of correct that. And at least in the 20th century, in the St. Louis context, there was the two unions that you mentioned did not come up in the kind of struggles that women were leading in St. Louis, but the Teamsters Union actually was one that stood out among many as one of the most progressive in terms of not only building interracial coalitions among workers who were kind of organizing around grievances, right, kind of along the lines of what you were suggesting, but also the Teamsters especially were thinking about expansive unionism. So they built health clinics, for instance, right? Trying to meet the needs of workers from that angle. Talking to workers about kind of the totality of their lives beyond the issue of wage consciousness. So there were only a handful that were thinking along these lines. But I would say now the trend actually is toward a more expansive unionism, and certainly toward kind of building across interracial lines. I think we see that in many, many, many cases, right? Unlike what we see in the 20th century. Yeah. It's one or two more. Okay. I think there's one.
Yes, Doctor, thank you very much. The
Ben, let me
presentation
get
was
it.
outstanding.
Thank you.
No, but some people, we do for people to hear.
Right. Just a great presentation.
Thank you.
Beautiful scholarship.
Thank you.
This is an aside question, but I noticed some of those giants you mentioned, these females,
Yeah.
had roots
Yeah.
from the South, but more to the point of my question,
Yeah.
rural.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm just wondering, in your research, and
Yeah.
as you looked at this,
Right.
is there evidence for cross-fertilization or cross-inspiration between the densities of women, black women in this case,
Mm-hmm.
from the urban
Mm-hmm.
settings
Right.
where they could generate a lot more power,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the rural, like the farm pieces?
Mm-hmm.
And did they ever move I'm from a farm, from the south.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, yeah.
There was a lot
Where are you
of fear
from?
going on.
Where are you?
Woodville, Mississippi.
Yeah,
so-
yeah, all right. Yeah, I asked because my parents are from Mississippi, and I always want to know if you. I consider myself a Southerner, even though I'm born and raised in St. Louis, border South, but I claim Mississippi as home. Anyway, yeah, so the connection between the rural and the urban, right? You're right, these women who are organizing are from the deep South especially, right? Orly Malone, a good example of that. And Mississippi becomes a kind of core state that feeds the migration to St. Louis in particular, right? So many black St. Louisans in this period have roots in Mississippi, are from that particular state. I think we like to kind of present these workers as kind of finding their political wings once they reach these new destinations, these urban locations. But I think the truth of the matter is that sense of community, right? The sense of collective action versus individual action, the sense of the notion that the North isn't the promised land that some make it out to be, right? That struggle continues. All of that comes from home, in a sense, right? And I think we could do better as when we tell this story of making that connection far more explicit, right? And it's not to say that they didn't kind of earn their political chops, you might say, in the North, right? Because they certainly had to learn that landscape in the way that municipalities ran and all of that. But at the same time, I think that kind of organizing tradition, I mean, Orly Malone was fighting for voting rights in the Deep South, certainly organizing for workers there. And she would say, St. Louis is not any better necessarily than Brooksville, Mississippi. The struggle continues. And Brooksville, Mississippi taught me how to engage racial justice questions and economic justice questions in St. Louis. Yeah.
Need a microphone on
I've got a really big voice.
you. I need you to use the microphone.
Yes, sir.
Last-
I heard you mention earlier you kind of consider yourself someone from the South, and you mentioned even though you're from St. Louis.
Right.
And it kind of struck me because of the Missouri thing.
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Ervin, I had a question concerning the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
And it's my contention that one of the unintended consequences was to replace the father in the black family with a check from Washington. Do you think LBJ had that in mind, or was it just an unintended consequence?
Interesting. Well, that certainly becomes a debate, I would say, in the 1960s with regard to, as you mentioned, Johnson's kind of anti-poverty legislation, right? And there were actually black community leaders in the 1960s who argued that one of the, as you say, one of the consequences, and I wouldn't say the Civil Rights Act in particular, but really kind of the scope of anti-poverty legislation, Great Society and the like, all of that. One of the unintended consequences was to break up, maybe even intended, some would argue intended in this period, but one of the consequences was kind of breaking up black families, right? That public housing tenants, for instance, in order to receive welfare allotments, for instance, had to prove that they were living on their own, that there wasn't a man in the house and the like. Some have made that argument. I'm more of the mind, however, that what gets lost, I think, in that discourse is the notion that black working women have been breadwinners in many cases for years and years and years. Like their work, the wages they earned were crucial to building families well before we see the rise of this anti-poverty legislation that tries to, kind of construct black families and black households in very particular ways. So I think that kind of gets lost in that conversation, that black working class women were disproportionately in the labor market for years and years prior to that. And they were holding families together with their wages, along with husbands or without husbands, with boyfriends or without boyfriends, and so forth. So, I think it does shift the discourse. I think there were some who argued just that point, but I'm more interested in thinking about the kind of longer-term history of how women were contributing to their households. Yeah.
We got one more question. Why don't, Sarah, will you hand out the feedback cards before you ask your question? We need to have you take a moment and fill out some feedback cards about this evening's event. This is important to us in terms of how we do things here and in justifying our existence to the university. Now,
For real, don't need that.
it helps for those who, some of us can't hear.
One, I want to thank you for your work. your
Thank you.
research. I was very excited to
Thank you.
discover your work, and I just want to encourage you
Thank
to
you.
keep going for as long as possible.
Thank you, thank
And
you.
the other thing I would like to say is, in your research on St. Louis,
Yeah.
are you finding, or will you consider looking for the unnamed Black women who worked in the newspaper and activities of newspaper development and the
Yeah.
media
Oh, yeah, yeah.
areas?
Yeah,
in
yeah.
St. Louis?
Well, I think that's a great suggestion and comment, because they are the ones who are in tune with or in tune to women who are often nameless in other kind of publications. And so I think what this work involves is kind of tracking and trying to kind of dig to find these names. But I like the suggestion of looking at Black women who are breaking barriers of their own in media, right? And through the history of kind of the Black newspaper, right? The St. Louis American, the St. Louis Argus, so many more across the country. But I think that's a great way to kind of think about it. How can I find some of these women, maybe through the pens of these Black women who are writing about these stories? So thank you for that. Yeah.
I'm going to use the director's prerogative and ask the final question.
Okay.
If you were, I always like to ask historians this.
Oh, yeah.
This is a fascinating history, and I agree with Dr. Shepard about your scholarship.
Thank
But
you.
yet I can't help but go back and think of what this woman asked about at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Now, something, in my way of thinking, is not right, come a long way.
Yeah.
When these kind of situations still occur to a
Right.
worker in America, we can all agree that's wrong.
Yeah.
So if you were sitting in front of the board of directors of the AFL-CIO, what would you tell them the labor movement needs to be doing today that they haven't been doing?
Oh, good question. Woo. Put me on the hot seat. What would I tell the board of the AFL-CIO?
That's what he gets paid. I ask those big questions.
I like the question. Listen. I think one problem that I see today, or see in this history, is an unwillingness to understand workers as the key to their own liberation in some ways, right? That they themselves have an intimate knowledge of the problems at their particular work sites, right? And that they can become kind of authorities on diagnosing problems. And that's not to say that, AFL-CIO board or, those who are kind of in official positions don't have expertise that is needed in these situations. But there's too often the case, I think, that we don't allow workers to have the floor, in terms of kind of charting the way forward. And I point to I would say too, so connected to that, look up Ella Baker, follow Ella Baker's model, right? Because she insisted on the power of ordinary people, right? To have not just a say in their own kind of progress, their own liberation, but that they have a kind of authority in charting the way forward. So she said, we don't want to do the style of some civil rights activists. We kind of swoop into a local community and swoop out. We give our speech and we leave, right? We want to commit ourselves to local communities and listen. Who are the people living there? What are their concerns? How can we get behind them and help push them forward, right? But local people, the workers themselves, are the authorities in kind of charting the way forward. That's what I would say.
Okay,
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for being here.
Thank you.
We appreciate your time in making the trek here. We present all of our guest speakers with Paul Simon's Greatest Hits.
Wonderful.
Which is
Wonderful.
Actually our Paul Simon.
Yeah.
Was a reporter, bought his first newspaper at 19 in Troy, and over the course of his career as a politician and as a journalist, wrote an awful lot, 22 books.
Impressive.
And I want to give you a copy of the book that Dr. Jackson wrote, sort of summarizing a lot of his work.
Wonderful.
And to thank you for your time in being with us today.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank all of you for being here.
Yeah, thank you.